Hi. Hi, I'm Julia Minamata. I am a solo indie game developer for the Crimson Diamond. I'm a pixel artist, I'm an art director. I'm based in Toronto, Ontario, Canada. And today I'm going to talk to you about how I got started in art and games and the many ways in which pixel art is amazing. And I'll show you guys my favorite pixel art technique and why you should consider pixel art for your next game. I was a freelance illustrator for 10 years. I went to art school and I got a Bachelor of Applied Arts illustration. Pixel art was my gateway to game development. My illustration style was already influenced a lot by computer games and by comic books. I was already using limited color palettes and dot patterns in my illustrations, so pixel art really felt like a natural transition for me. This was my pixel art happy place, the late 80s and early 90s. These are the games that most influenced my illustration style. I loved the bright colors, I loved the clean, clear lines and shapes of EGA art, and when my freelance career was stalling and I had more free time, I started to explore pixel art. Because I had such positive associations with the games of my childhood, making pixel art felt really relaxing and really comforting. And while the method of drawing was different, I was able to apply a lot of what I learned in art school to the screens I was making, a lot about color and tone and composition. Here is my very first pixel art room using my favorite EGA 16 color palette. It is not in my game The Crimson Diamond, but I think it was a pretty promising start for me. After I created this first room, I created the little character that you see to the left to fit inside the room. As soon as I did that, I realized that the scale of the furniture in proportion with the character was kind of not great, and so I moved on to my second room, which is a kitchen and is in the Crimson Diamond. I wanted her to be able to walk around the furniture. I wanted her to move from room to room. And as I started to want these things, I started to learn a program called Adventuron Studio, and I learned to do things as I needed them thanks to YouTube tutorials and the Adventure Game Studio forums. The pixel art rooms at this point, it wasn't a game yet. It was more like a digital dollhouse that I would tinker with and then go and do some freelance illustration. And when I was less busy, I would come back to it and add another room here and there, learn a new thing here and there, learn how to do animations and all the rest of it that comes with it. I was using Photoshop for my illustrations, so it felt natural for me to use it for the pixel art as well. And Adventure Game Studio is a free program. I think it is so important not only that the tools were freely available, but that they didn't require heavy duty hardware to run. I didn't have to buy new software and new hardware to do any of this. I didn't have to invest any money in anything really. And so it made it really easy for me to try and experiment and play around. And that was to me super important, and I don't know if the tools were harder to access if I would have gotten to get to a stage of development where I am today. These are some screens from the Crimson Diamond. The upper left is the kitchen that I was telling you about, my second attempt at a pixel art room. I was able to kind of make game screens that looked a lot like the stuff I remembered so fondly from childhood because of how easy it is to actually pick apart and analyze pixel art. And I'll talk about that a little bit later, but I think pixel art is a wonderful thing to learn, and it's easier to learn in some ways than traditional artwork is. It didn't take long for me to start dreaming up a story and a setting that would go with this place that I had created, and the characters that would go along with the place, and who lived there, and who was visiting, and why they were all there. What started as an exercise in nostalgia and revisiting warm and fuzzy memories of my childhood became this ongoing game project that I started to develop. And I found myself really enjoying doing the research for the setting and writing the story and being creative in ways I hadn't been in ages. Because for 10 years I was just doing the visual stuff and being creative that way. But I was getting to not only write a story, but write dialogue and do this game design thing that I'd never tried before. And all those things were challenging me in different ways. And I got to learn so many different new things during this time. Pixel art principles and pixel art predecessors. Pixel art is a form of digital art. It's loosely defined as requiring digital technology for its creation or presentation. But there are lots of non digital artistic mediums in history that share a few things in common with pixel art. And let's just take a look at some of those right now. The first one is the Alexander mosaic from Pompeii from 100 BCE. And this just goes for mosaics in general. For me, one of the principles of pixel art is that the units are distinct. And what I mean by that is you can see the component parts of what make up that piece of art. And so for the mosaic, we have these little bits of tile of different colors, and the colors don't blend, but the appearance of a blended color happens when you put two or three colors that are very close in tone and in color next to each other. But we can see each piece on its own. And so if you really wanted to recreate something like this, you don't have to interpret anything, you don't have to dissect anything, it's all here to look at. This is the Overhogdal tapestries from Sweden from 800 to 1100 AD. This is another, for me, another principle of pixel art where not only do you have these discrete units that are visible to the eye, but it's built around and on a grid system. And tapestries, of course, are sewn into fabric with a warp and a waft, warp and weave. I don't know the weaving terms, but it's basically a grid because fabric is woven like a grid. And what we get is we get these rectilinear shapes and these lines that, while they don't really look as distinct in terms of units as the mosaic does, but it is a principle of being on a grid, just as pixel art is on a grid. The larger the weave, the larger the shapes would be. As with when the lower the resolution, the blockier the pixels are, the chunkier everything looks. The finer the resolution, the higher the resolution, the smoother everything looks. And cross stitch, this is from 1970s from McCall's pattern, incorporates both of those principles that I think makes it the closest to pixel art out of anything that can be done physically, which is these discrete units where we've got each stitch is considered its own stitch that can be seen by the human eye, and there's this underlying grid system where everything is put into that grid. So if you had the grid pattern for this piece, or you superimposed your own grid pattern over this cross stitch pattern, you would be able to duplicate this. One of the fun things about pixel art is that it can be easily recreated in some of those already existing familiar artistic forms, and it can be really fun for fans of games who like certain sprites from a pixel art game to recreate that stuff in a number of different mediums. For mosaic, for the Alexander mosaic, we've got this Kirby mosaic sort of in the top right. Lego, of course, is very grid based, so we've got this fire flower. Underneath the fire flower is this Perler Beach shovel knight. Underneath that is kind of a mosaic, a tile pattern of a Space Invader. On the far left is a cross-stitch pattern that I'd made myself for one of the main character for my game, Nancy Maple, in the Crimson Diamond. And I actually did go a bit overboard trying to find the exact right EGA colors I wanted to use to convey the piece. And far right is a lovely quilt that my mom actually made for me for the sprite, her little sprite as she walks around the world. It's great because at a low resolution, you can actually do these things, and it's easy for people to see and break down and recreate in the real world, which is part of the magic for me, is seeing something digital that originated digitally physically out there. And I don't know, there's something about that gets me really excited. Dot-based artistic techniques. Looking at the different artistic mediums like the mosaic, the tapestry, and the cross-stitching that can be used to resemble pixel art, there are techniques within mediums that might also look familiar. The first one I want to look at is pointillism. And Georges Seurat did a series of paintings in this pointillism technique where individual daubs of pure color are applied to the canvas, where you look at it close up, it just looks like a bunch of dots. You step back from it, your eye blends these colors together to create different colors and different forms that the colors that you're seeing that your eye's blending aren't really there, but it's just a magical effect, the magical pixel art, really. But what I love about pointillism is, when you go up close, the brilliance of each of those daubs of paint is preserved. And here's the full painting when you look at it from further away. You can see how it does resolve to shapes and colors that you might not have expected when you see the ultra close-up. Another example of dot-based artistic technique in a medium is in print. We have comic books, and we have something called tone dots, or they're sometimes called Ben-Day dots. There's also halftone dots. And this is a piece that can show, her face has got red dots in it, but we're not thinking about them as red dots. We're actually thinking of them as a third or fourth or fifth color, an extra color that doesn't actually exist in the piece. And this is actually a really nice example of what Ben-Day dots are. Ben-Day dots can be overlaid on top of each other to produce additional color effects, but they are still grid-based. It's much the same as my favorite pixel art technique, which is called dithering, which I'm going to get into very shortly. Here are some of my silkscreened illustrations that did use tonal dots and the Bend-A dots. So an example of what the difference is between the Bend-A dot and the halftone is a halftone dots can be graduated in size. They can go from small to large or large to small. Well, a screen tone dot or a Bend-A dot is all the same size unit. So I guess that would be closer to pixel art than the halftone. But yeah, I was already using limited color palettes, tonal dots. It's no surprise that pixel art clicked almost immediately for me. Dithering works a lot the same as the tonal dots, and it's interesting to note that in comic book printing, in silkscreen printing, dithering and pixel art, all these are similar techniques that originated as a way to produce the effect of additional colors without additional passes through a printing press, using another silkscreen, or increasing the file size of a finished game. In all of these instances, it was more efficient to visually trick the eye with small dots of color than to increase the actual number of colors being used. And here is dithering, the magic of dithering, and here's a breakdown of what that looks like. So why don't we go from largest to small. So upper right we have this checkerboard pattern of bright red and bright green. It clashes, it looks horrendous, it's really hard on the eyes. But if we make that dither pattern smaller, we can see it still as a checkerboard, but our eye is starting to blend it into a color that is in between those two colors. We take it even smaller to the bottom left, and that swatch of 8 colors, it's this nice olive green type of look. And that's only, this whole grid of 256 variations of dithering are a result of 2 color combinations of the 16 colors that are along the bottom right. And it produces, just to me, when I see this type of thing at a certain resolution where it's big enough where you can see the checkerboard, but it's not so big that the checkerboard is leaping into your face, that's what I like. That middle ground is where I like it, because then I can see what is happening and what the artist's choices were. And here are some color variations that you can achieve with different with dithering patterns that can make it look like different lighting conditions, different times of day. I don't see a lot of dithering being used much in pixel art right now, and I'd love to change that. I would encourage anyone who loves pixel art, and it doesn't even have to be the 16 color palette. It could be a 2 color palette, 1 color palette, anything. There's something about this that I don't know. It really gets me excited when I see it. And here's my example of what that can look like. And as a close-up of this carriage house that is in the Crimson Diamond, we can see at this particular resolution, you can see the checkerboard pattern on the left and all the dithered colors. And the side-by-side comparison on the right is what I try to do with my eye, the closest approximation of what color would have been produced with that visual blending that the left-hand side is doing. The advantage of using the 16 colors and the dithering versus having these unique flat colors on the right-hand side is that throughout the game only uses 16 colors, and so when you have only 16 colors you're using universally throughout in every aspect, every sprite, every background, it becomes really harmonious and everything kind of works together in a really pleasing way. And as well with the pointillism, the brilliance of each of these colors is being preserved in this way. If we kind of blended everything together, like on the right hand side, I'd be using way more colors. Not that it's really a problem nowadays. The technological advancements have made it so much easier for you to basically use as many colors as you want. But it would kind of make them, it kind of gives them, it dulls them down. Just the act of blending colors together will dull them down from the purest colors that you start with. And let's take a look at graphic adventure games, my favorite genre, and the resources that were required to develop them in their day. First, we have Mystery House from 1980. This was programmed for the Apple II personal computer. It was written, designed, and illustrated by Roberta Williams, programmed by her husband Ken, who took 2 days to code it. Kind of an indie game jam kind of feel to that, which is kind of awesome. It eventually sold 80,000 units and led them to incorporate their company into Sierra Online. For King's Quest VI in 1992, Sierra Online, this had a $700,000 US budget at the time, which is equivalent to about $1.3 million in 2020. It had a crew of more than 20 people working for 14 months. It sold between 300 and 400,000 units. Then we have Day of the Tentacle from 1993, had a $600,000 budget approximately. And Broken Sword, 1996, from Revolution Software, £1 million budget. These were considered the AAA blockbusters of their day. They took, anywhere between, 14 months to maybe 2 4 years, a crew, hundreds of thousands of dollars, a lot of resources, and not even just the resources to develop the games. We're talking resources in production, putting them all on floppy disks, warehousing, distribution, all these things added to that cost. We look at graphic adventure games now, and it's very exciting to see how these technological advancements and digital distribution have made it possible for small or solo indie game studios to produce work that looks just as good or even better and have as much gameplay as the adventure games from decades ago. All of these games were made in approximately a range of the same amount of time as the old adventure games from the 90s were, but at a fraction of the budget and with far fewer people than those games of the past, which is super exciting because it really opens it up to anybody who wants to make a game of a professional quality can do that with a much smaller team or even by yourself. And this is one of the reasons why we have these efficiencies. Speaking of the efficiency of pixel art, I love telling this story about the Dark Side Detective. The Dark Side Detective started as a game jam game. It was an 8-hour game jam prototype that had such a positive reception. They decided they were going to make it for commercial release. They thought they were going to maybe upgrade the graphics, but people loved the graphics as they were so much. All they did was they upscaled by 400% and they added some additional lighting effects. And in this way, they were able to produce this game that started off as efficiency only, but it's beautiful as it is, and people love it as it is. It's not just efficient, it's evocative. Pixel art is no longer just a solution to deal with the space and cost limitation of shipping games on multiple floppy disks. Neither is it just an appeal to nostalgia. The medium can have any style, creating very different tones to the games in which they're used. My first example is The Last Door, which it's literally faceless horror. It's a wonderfully atmospheric, spooky game, and the chunkiness, this is a very low resolution game, but not having those faces allows the player to really fill in the gaps with their imagination. And to me, that's the best of what horror can be. Your imagination will produce spookier impressions than any artist can ever do. And that's what I love about The Last Door and what they chose to do with their pixel art and the resolution they chose to do it at. Then we have Space Warlord Organ Trading Simulator. This is a game that I worked on for Strange Scaffold. Space Warlord Organ Trading Simulator creative director Zalavery Nelson Jr. says he doesn't have nostalgia for pixel art, but he recognizes how distinct treatments of it, like a monochrome dithering of early Apple machines, have very, very different effects on the final impact on the viewer, even if they aren't directly aware of the source. So even if they didn't play games on the Apple machines, people can still look at these graphics and find that they're different in a really cool way. And I did find that when I was showing the Crimson Diamond at events, is I would have younger people come up to me who did not play adventure games in the 90s, who they would just, their eye was caught by the bright colors. And I felt really excited by that because I had thought that I was servicing a niche where only people who had these fond memories of the type of game that I was building would be interested in it. But that wasn't true. It's just the bright colors and the look of it was appealing enough. Zelifer continues by saying, pixel art has an incredible amount of versatility, conveying either deeply analog or digital sensations with equal ease depending on the artist. When I choose pixel art for a project, I'm searching for a medium of art that allows the creators to put a tangible, intentional stamp on every aspect of the game. And to me, the aesthetic that he chose for Space Warlord Organ Trading Simulator really recalls those old green screen computer terminals in a kind of a gritty, futuristic but past futuristic way that I think he did a really good job in art directing this game. And speaking of monochrome dithering from early Apple machines evoking a certain analog sensation, we have World of Horror, which looks like a manga, a Japanese horror manga, which is a deep, very analog paper and ink type of production. But the style that they used and the way that it's depicted is very evocative of that style, just from the style that they decided to use for their game. And the last one I have is a game called Party Hard, which I like to contrast with The Last Door because they're using the same technique of these faceless, fairly low resolution graphics, but to a completely different end. Party Hard is kind of a spoof of slasher movies, where you are this masked vigilante type of person who is kind of getting the better of a bunch of rowdy partiers. And this game could be a lot more horrific if it was more grisly and graphic and gory. But because it's low resolution and you don't identify with the partiers because you're kind of pulled back from the situation and they don't have faces, it does lighten the tone a lot. And that just goes to show the versatility of the styles, even when you're using the same techniques, based on color and music and all the rest of the things that go on with the game. Pixel art is very approachable for new developers. There are so many different tools for pixel art nowadays. You don't need a high-end PC to create pixel art. You can use a tablet. There are in-browser applications to create pixel art. There are even apps for your phone, which I picked up one. I think I got either Dotpicked or Pixel Studio. I don't remember which one I picked up, but I just picked it up to play around with it. Very impressive, I have to say. Which is wonderful. You can be on the go. You can work on pixel art. You can do it on any platform. So the approachability of the medium, it's never been better. But I can't draw. I know a lot of people are saying I can't draw, but what's great about pixel art is, like I said before, it can be broken down in a way that's easy to analyze. Just as a comparison, on the left we have placing a grid on top of a drawing is a way for artists to accurately reproduce artwork, either for educational purposes or for enlarging their own artwork, but that still does require a lot of skill, because as we can see on this left-hand example, there's a lot of tone that's going on within the large grid squares that you have to come up with your own interpretation. But with pixel art is completely made up of squares, all you need to do is superimpose that grid over that piece of art, and you can see exactly what the artist did, what color they used, and what the line looks like. And sometimes simple shapes are enough to depict objects, depending on the context, which is another aspect of the magic of pixel art that I find so appealing. Like, what could this be? What is this long white rectangle? It could be just about anything, which is the importance of context, which I'm going to show in this next slide here. But I can't draw part 2. The lower the resolution, the less detail you need, which is wonderful. I have this picture of this fruit bowl that I just got off the internet, and I rendered it in steadily descending resolution. So we have 92 by 72 all the way down to 12 by 9. And at 12 by 9, I can acknowledge that it's starting to look less like a fruit bowl. But if I put it on a table shape with something that kind of looks like a wine bottle with a couple rectangles that kind of look like they've got white wine and water in them, those long white rectangles become plates. And it's a lot like Lego. If you have a bunch of brown cubes, that doesn't really mean anything, but if you stack brown cubes on top of each other and put a large green mass on top of that, you've got a tree. And I love that. And so don't feel intimidated by feeling like you can't accurately render a fruit bowl or a tree. You don't need to in pixel art. There's so much of the work gets done with where that thing is among other things. And here's just an example where I've taken the color out even. And even taking the color out, you can still kind of read this as a table with a fruit bowl, with plates, and a couple glasses on it. And you could, I didn't really even adjust the tone here, but even with no color at all, you can kind of work with that. What color should I use? This is a big question people have, and it is subjective. People have different tastes in colors depending on how they're feeling even at the time. But there is a certain aspect of color which is not subjective, which is legibility. Ultimately, it doesn't really matter what colors you choose, but the tone is what's important. We've got some examples here that I've shown, so you can see a lot of these have maybe some variety of one color, or completely different colors like this pink, brown, green, navy blue type of thing. And what's really helpful with this with @Deathrude2 on Twitter, they actually desaturated that piece themselves, and there is a variety of tones where you can see what's happening, and that's more important than anything else. If you look at my favorite EGA color palette along the bottom of the left here, it's got very bright colors, but once you desaturate it, you can see some of these can be very close in tone. The light green and the light cyan are pretty close in tone when we look at them after their color information has been stripped out. So in terms of color, it is a subjective thing, but also it can be objective, because you don't want something that's hard to see. You want something where the player can look at it and clearly make out what's going on. So this is my example of using those two colors. You don't want to use them this way. You'd want to pick something that's lighter or darker. But of course, exceptions prove the rule. This is a beautiful low contrast pixel art piece by Gijo the Hydroid on Twitter, who does a number of these gorgeous different scenes. So there is room for just about everything, and these are just kind of basic guidelines, not rules, that I'm showing. Color palettes online. Let's say, yeah, you have really no, you can't pick colors and you don't want to. There are so many online resources where people have done the work for you. Also, if you want to emulate a certain vintage computer look, I use this EGA color palette on the far left. There's a Commodore 64 palette as well, and even an original Game Boy palette. And these are all from lowspec.com. Lowspec is a really great resource in general, not just for palettes, but for pixel art tutorials, for lists of software that are far more complete than what I showed as examples. And another thing I love about this palette site is that you can download these palettes and import them directly into Photoshop, into GIMP, as PNGs. Wonderful site for not only vintage color palettes but also user-generated palettes. There are other color palette sites that also have other things to offer. I really like color.adobe.com. They have this dynamic color wheel where you can slide these small circles around this larger circle, and according to different color theories or color rules that you can pick along the left side of here, we've got analogous, monochromatic, tonal, complementary. You can drag these around and it will generate color palettes that will work together well with each other, and according to whatever sets of rules you want to define. The bottom right is canva.com. It's cool because you can take a photo that you really like, you can just drop it in this browser, and it will give you a color palette with hex values and everything. Another really cool thing that I want to play more with. And yeah, there are other ones. There's coolers.co and colorhunt.co. A lot of just an embarrassment of riches of user-generated color palettes if you are truly that stuck. Here are some tips for creating pixel art that may help you get started. This illusion of depth is important with just about any game, because what it does is it prioritizes where the viewer is looking. And of course the foreground should be the most important. And there are ways to make the foreground the most important and the closest appearing part of an image. And that appearance of depth can be achieved by a bunch of different ways. One of them is contrast or atmospheric perspective, which we have here for the upper left. We have the Secret of Monkey Island. We can see this beautiful island here off the shore. Well, on the shore, literally. And how distant this small mountain here just above the canyon looks, because it's bluer. And as we get closer to the viewer, as the island gets closer to the viewer, things get warm up, and there's less blue in here, more greens and more browns. And that's because of something called atmospheric perspective. Especially if you're outdoors and if it's blue sky, things are further back. They tend to take on bluer hues, cooler hues, which can be a nice way to give that impression of something far away. The last door on the top right also uses that, where this way it's kind of like a misty, kind of snowy day, so that distance is achieved by making things lighter and more yellow going into the back. It also uses another kind of trick where the sizing of things creates that sense of depth. So the trees in the back are smaller than the trees that are in the front. And saturation is also a thing. These front trees are more saturated and higher contrast than the stuff in the back. The stuff in the back is you almost can't see these, which really gives you this feeling of like either they're really far away or it's kind of foggy outside. Saturation and color can also be seen in this screenshot from the Dark Side Detective at the bottom left, where the colors are more bright closer to us in the foreground here than the airplanes on the tarmac. And what I love about the Shovel Knight screenshot on the bottom right is it uses a lot of those tricks all put together, where we have in the background the trees are getting bluer, the shadow there is getting bluer, the contrast is reduced, the size is reduced. Everything here is giving you that indication of depth. And this thing here in the middle is just what I slapped together in my EGA color palette to demonstrate those same principles, where we've got far off mountains that are bluer, the far off trees are kind of bluer as well and smaller. Another thing to think about is the illusion of light and shadow. The EGA color palette is really handy because it can generally be separated by light and dark versions of these 8 colors. We got the red, yellow, green, 2 blues, a purple, white, and the black. But with a little creativity, some really amazing and unique lighting can be achieved. The basic lighting, as I've described it just now, is you can see in the Space Quest 2 screenshot where there's this overhang that's casting a shadow on the grass and the sand. The sand is yellow, and the shadow on the sand is the brown color. The grass is light green, but the shadow cast is the darker green. And it even gets into these little grains of sand where you've got white little grains of sand. You can almost not see them, but little white grains of sand, but in the shadow, they're light gray, and the brown grains of sand, they've been given kind of a black color. And it's a wonderful illusion of the sense of light and shadow with just solid color. The kernel's bequest here on the right hand side, it does that dithering that I showed earlier to show different color combinations, but it can also be used to achieve different lighting situations. And this one here, we have this dark cyan on the brighter side of the plantation house, but the part that's not being hit by the light has got this black dither on it. So it's black and the dark cyan checkerboard pattern, which gives the impression of a darker area. Same goes with the grass. There's the dark green, but the dark green dithered with the black gives that impression of this cast shadow. Along the bottom, I've got some just better examples, hopefully clear examples to show each of these principles. Far left, we have darker version of the color equals shadow. So the gray in the shadow is dark gray. The red in the shadow is dark red. The green in the shadow is dark green, and so on. The one the second from the left is how dithering can be used to achieve the appearance of shadow, just laid on top of the already existing color. We can combine these two techniques to make a stronger shadow. So this part here is black dithering with the dark red here, and then the dark green with the black dither. The cool thing is that the colors don't have to be the ones that are directly across from each other. They don't have to be yellow and then the shadow of that is brown. It just has to be darker. And here is something I almost randomly did this where I took, okay, well here's the light gray. What's darker than the light gray? Well, the dark purple. So I'm going to make the dark purple the shadow color for this color. The darker color for this, the light red can be brown. So let's put the brown next to it. And so on. And that does create this impression of a shadow, but not as straightforward as the lighting condition on the far left. And that can also be combined on the far right with different colors to cast a shadow. So we have different colors of dithers combined with different colors in the shadow, in the solid shadow color, which again can give you the impression of so many different colors. And that's why dithering for me is really exciting and why I want more people to use it, because I love the effects that can be achieved with something as simple as this. And here is one of the processes step by step of how I would construct an outdoor environment that uses a lot of the stuff I just discussed, where we have these larger shapes in the foreground, these larger trees. There are higher contrast trees in the foreground as well. And then the stuff in the background is, you can see that the foliage on the coniferous trees looks finer and smaller. Trees in the further back, we've got this blue color that kind of gives the appearance that those are really far back. And I'm going to take it to the next slide so you can see the funnel and just look at it for a little, because I think this animation goes by a little quickly. Okay. So we've got a limited palette, low resolution pixel art. It may seem restrictive, but it can actually really free up the creative process. When I was a freelance illustrator, I really enjoyed and I took pride in working to limitations. What dimensions the piece had to be, what the content was of the article I was illustrating, where it would even appear on the printed page. For instance, so if it was a double page spread and the illustration was going to appear on the left hand side, I didn't want the weight of the illustration to be directed out of the magazine. I wanted it to direct toward where the writing was. All these types of compositional concerns and things like that. It's extremely rewarding problem solving, and the results can be something incredibly specific and unique. There are game engines that also follow the same philosophy of limitations as a means of liberating creativity from too many choices. Pico-8 is a great example. Pico-8 is a game engine that was designed to mimic the strict hardware restrictions of designing console games in the early 80s. It pairs perfectly with the philosophy of pixel art in that way. And according to the Wikipedia page for Pico-8, the restrictions are meant to spur creativity and prevent developers from being overwhelmed by an overabundance of tools, which happens to me a lot. So I appreciate having these sets of restrictions, and it's $15. So it's not a huge investment to give this thing a try. Adventuron is one that I really like. It is a browser-based game engine designed specifically for text parser adventure games with static graphics. And you can see what I love is how simple these graphics are. And because it's text parser, the text descriptions in these games can help describe what the player is seeing. And the simpler graphics are very effective at setting these tones and actually letting the player's imagination take over and fill in the gaps of how non-specific the artwork is, which I think is really magical. And it reminds me of just reading a book, but with a little bit of a visual cue. Another benefit of Adventuron and the simple graphics you can use in Adventuron is when you design a game in Adventuron, you can have it work pretty easily on a mobile phone. And when you've got a phone with a much smaller screen, simpler graphics read really well and they reduce really well for the player. Adventure Game Studio is what I've been using to build the Crimson Diamond. It's it's free engine, it's got a thriving community. If you're interested in developing adventure games of the style of The Secret of Monkey Island or the King's Quest games, I wholeheartedly recommend it. There are commercial releases that are out now and that are currently being developed, such as Lamplight City, Kathy Rain, Unavowed. It's wonderful because Adventure Game Studio is free and open source. Pico-8 costs $15. Adventuron is also free. They're great tools. They're super lightweight. You don't need a top-of-the-line computer to run them. Anyone can make pixel art. Anyone can make games that incorporate pixel art. The upcoming Playdate handheld console is another example of highly restrictive specs being a jumping off point for creativity. It only runs low resolution, so we've got 400 by 240 pixel resolution, black and white games. It's got a directional pad, 2 buttons, and a funny metal crank. I was really fortunate. I actually got to art direct a game for the Playdate. Making art assets in black and white was a lot of fun, and it's challenging to solve game design problems as well with just that limited tool set. Games do not have to be the flashiest, slickest 3D graphics to be fun. I fell in love with the thing as soon as I saw it, and so it was really a pleasure for me to be able to help make a game for it. And in terms of is this something people want, or is a console that is this limited and restricted in its specifications desirable? Well, the first 20,000 unit run was pre-ordered in 20 minutes. So there are plenty of people out there that are just as excited as I am. Space Warlord Organ Trading Simulator by Strange Scaffold, releasing this year. It also makes use of the limited color palette. I created one color pixel art for the game, super low resolution. These character portraits are 50 by 50, and the organs, the little organ inventory icons, are 25 by 25 pixels. I've never made such small little pieces of pixel art before, and this was my first time making this 1-bit type of monochromatic pixel art, and I had a blast. Xalavir likes to make great games fast, so 1-bit pixel art is a great tool for his toolbox, and I hope he returns to this because I'd love to work with him on other things. EGA portrait commissions. I also make EGA color palette portrait commissions, and the great thing about doing low-res portraits like this in bright colors is they read really well even if they're tiny. A lot of the people who commission me to do portraits for them are using them on social media for their avatars, and when you see them on the timelines, they're pretty tiny, but because of how bright they are and how low-res they are legible. I can recognize the people on my timeline from the profile picture alone. In that way, pixel art has highly practical applications that isn't just nostalgic. Conclusion. Pixel art is more than nostalgic. It's efficient, it's economical, it's evocative, it can do so many things at once. Low-resolution pixel art can be both a stylistic choice and a way for new or solo or indie game devs to create their own projects with their own art with limited resources and or art skills. Pixel art is a medium and a modern movement that isn't limiting, it's limitless. For me, pixel art changed my life for the better. It has been a comfort and a hobby. It's why I've met and worked with so many amazing people. I've traveled to events. I've had so many new experiences. I've learned so much. Pixel art is why I'm talking to you guys today. It was my gateway into the gaming industry, and who knows what it could do for you. And thanks for listening. Happy Halloween. I'm Julia Minamata. You can find me on Twitter at Julia Minamata. You can go to thecrimsondiamond.com for all my social media stuff. I do streaming as well on Twitch with art dev. So if you want to see me work on EGA game art, I stream on Tuesdays at 8 p.m. Eastern, and sometimes I've got my musician Dan Polakar, and we do tracks for the game live on stream as well. So thank you so much for having me. This was a pleasure, and I'll take it back to the